Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. Today is October 26. In today's daily Bible reading, we come across a group of teachings of Jesus often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. These teachings for many people are somewhat familiar, at least specific excerpts from these teachings. One of the things for us to realize is that this is probably not a single moment when Jesus is teaching all of these things, but more than likely is a collection of Jesus' greatest teachings that may have been spoken more than once on more than one occasion. We call this collection of teachings in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 the Sermon on the Mount, but we also sometimes refer to a similar collection of teachings in Luke's Gospel as the Sermon on the Plain. So there are some differences, some things that are unique to Matthew and some things that are unique to Luke. But in this chronological Bible that we're reading together this year, we'll see that most of these things are kind of dovetailed together as we try to understand the teachings of Jesus and the point of those teachings. Really, what we find here is great information about Jesus himself, because we see Jesus not focusing on rules and regulations like these people were accustomed to keeping based on the old law of Moses, but Jesus is really digging down deep, trying to get people to reveal their heart, trying to get people to learn how to love God with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their mind, and with all their strength, and showing them through these teachings what such love actually looks like in practice. One of the things the Pharisees have really honed in on is how to keep the letter of the law, the specifics, but they haven't really understood the heart behind the law. And that's what Jesus is trying to drive at with the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll see some specific examples of that a little bit later. The Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes, as they're commonly referred to. These are those familiar sayings: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled, and so on. Jesus is talking about some Beatitudes. A good way to remember this is be-attitudes. These are some attitudes of how we should be, how we should think, how we should act. That Jesus is dealing once again with the heart. Now, one of the things Luke does in his gospel is he adds not only to these blessings, these Beatitudes, but he also gives some woes that Jesus pronounces. They're not as familiar, but they are almost the opposite of the Beatitudes. Notice at the bottom of page 1381 in today's reading, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for that is how your fathers treated the false prophets." So you see that these woes pronounced by Jesus, as recorded in Luke's gospel, really serve as sort of the opposites or a reciprocal kind of effect to those Beatitudes with which we are most familiar. Now, Jesus moves on from there and starts to talk about the nature of believers, that they are to be the salt of the earth. They are to be what gives the earth its flavor, the light of the world, the ones to whom the world looks to find that hope, that reason for living, that reason for going on. He talks about law in the gospel. His purpose is not to abolish the law. He didn't come to put away the law of Moses, but he says rather to fulfill it. He wants to take it to a new level. He wants to show people how to not only keep the laws and the rules, but to understand the heart of God that is behind those laws and rules. As a matter of fact, he even says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, then you have no hope," basically. He's looking for people who have a greater righteousness. Now, while that may seem unattainable from some, Jesus is basically saying what makes the righteousness real, what makes it great, is to put the heart behind it, to understand why those rules and those regulations are in place. And then he goes through the rest of chapter 5 of Matthew, making some illustrations of how this law is to be fulfilled. He says, for example, you've heard in the old law, you shall not murder. Now, I'm not coming, he says, to put away that law. That's a good law. But I want to take it to another level. He says, I want you to not only not murder someone, but don't even be angry with your brother. That's a heart issue. And it's as if Jesus is saying, you know what? If you get your heart right, if you deal with the anger, you'll never have a problem with murder. If you deal with lust in your heart, you'll never have a problem with committing adultery, and so on. And he does this throughout the rest of chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. He also talks about how we retaliate with one another, how we treat one another, what the law gives us permission to do, but what we do when fulfilling that based upon a desire to please God with our hearts. He talks about loving our enemies. Anybody can love those who love them. He says, if I love a person who loves me, what good is that? But we distinguish ourselves as followers of Christ even today by loving those who don't love us, by lending to those who can't repay us, by doing good anyway, regardless of that other person. He talks about giving from the heart. He talks about praying from the heart. He talks about fasting. And all of this done not to put on a display for other people to see, but simply to evolve or to develop into one's deeper relationship with God. Even when he's teaching his disciples to pray, he wants them to connect with God. And he wants them to understand that only when we learn how to forgive from our heart will God also forgive us. He talks about there being a treasure in our heart. This is God living in us. And in him is where we find our greatest value, our greatest treasure. He talks about the need for undivided loyalty, that we can't serve God along with something else or someone else, but that God is to be our all in all. We give him everything that we have. And when we learn to do that, we can avoid worry. We don't have to be anxious and wringing our hands about the things that we can't control or understand in our lives. As a matter of fact, his solution for worry is simply that we seek God first, that we put him first and think about his kingdom and how we can be a part of that and let him take care of all those other things over which we really have no control. And when we start to see ourselves in this way, we don't judge other people. We don't put people in a place where we're thinking that we're better than they are. We also look for a way to encourage those that are around us in everything that we do, knowing that we too are human and we too have our own flaws. So we need to be careful in our judgmental attitudes toward one another. We need to seek God. To ask, and it will be given to you, he says. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened. Ask, seek, knock. But notice the initiative there is on us. When we ask, he says, you will always be given. When you seek, you will find. And when you knock, the door will be opened. That's how God wants us to interact with him. And then he gives the golden rule, as we like to call it, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. In the way that we would like for others to treat us, that's the way we treat them. We don't treat people as they treat us, or we don't do to people because they do to us. We do to people anyway, the way we would want them to do to us. It is the golden rule. And so we want to make sure that our discipleship is sincere, that we're not false disciples, that what you see on the outside is what you have on the inside. And we demonstrate our love for God simply by doing his will. Jesus says, the one who hears his word and does it is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock that cannot be harmed by the storms of life. Isn't it great to be a lamplighter? His word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. I hope you have a blessed day.